Most people think piracy was some kind of democratic paradise on the water. Shared loot, equal votes, a brotherhood of outcasts sailing under the black flag together. And sure, some of that was true. Pirates did vote, they did split treasure, they did elect their captains. But here's what the romanticized version leaves out. Some captains were so violent, so unpredictable, and so completely unhinged that the men who sailed with them didn't stay out of loyalty. They stayed because the alternative was worse, because they'd seen what happened to the last man who questioned an order, because leaving meant either swimming or dying, and sometimes both led to the same place. These 5 pirates didn't just terrorize the seas, they terrorized the people standing right next to them, their own crews, the men who ate beside them, fought beside them, and slept 10 feet away from them every single night. And if you trace a map across the Caribbean, down through the South American coast, across the Atlantic to West Africa, and into the South China Sea, you'll find that brutality wasn't limited to one ocean or one century. It showed up everywhere, different waters, different decades. Same result. Crews who followed their captain not because they wanted to, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. This is the story of 5 pirates so brutal, even the men who called them captain slept with one eye open. Pirate number 5, Roach Braziliano. Let's start in the mid-1600s. The Caribbean is a lawless stretch of blue water connecting Spanish treasure routes, English colonies, and French buccaneering outposts. Port Royal, Jamaica, is the unofficial capital of piracy. A town so drunk and violent that even seasoned sailors called it the wickedest city on earth. And in the middle of all that chaos, one man managed to stand out as especially terrible. His name was Roach Braziliano, a Dutch pirate who'd spent time in Brazil before relocating to Jamaica, which is where the Braziliano came from. He wasn't the most successful pirate of his era. He wasn't the most strategic. He wasn't even particularly clever. But he was, by virtually every account, one of the most feared men in the Caribbean. Not by the Spanish, not by the English, by his own crew. The problem with Braziliano wasn't just that he was violent. Plenty of pirates were violent. Violence was the job description. The problem was that Braziliano was violent and unpredictable, which is a combination that makes everyone around you very, very nervous. When he was sober, he was tolerable, maybe even functional. But when he drank, and he drank constantly, he became something else entirely. According to Alexandre Esquemelin, a former buccaneer who wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Caribbean piracy, Braziliano would stagger through the streets of Port Royal, swinging his cutlass at anyone who crossed his path. Not enemies, not rivals, random people, bystanders. Fellow pirates who happened to be standing too close. His crew learned quickly that the safest place to be when Braziliano was drinking was somewhere else. But it wasn't just the drunken rampages that made him dangerous. It was what he did to prisoners. Braziliano had a particular hatred for the Spanish, and when he captured Spanish sailors or settlers, things got ugly fast. Esquemelin describes incidents where Braziliano would roast Spanish prisoners alive on wooden spits, like animals over a fire. Not as punishment for some specific offense, not to extract information, just because he could, just because he was angry or bored or drunk enough to think it was entertaining. His crew participated in these acts, but not with enthusiasm. They participated because saying no to Braziliano meant becoming the next person on the spit. There's a difference between cruelty you choose and cruelty you perform, because the alternative is being on the receiving end of it. Braziliano was eventually captured by the Spanish, which you'd think would be the end of the story. But he talked his way out of it. He convinced the Spanish authorities that if they executed him, the buccaneers of Jamaica would retaliate against every Spanish settlement in the region. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. The Spanish believed him and let him go. He went right back to pirating, right back to drinking, right back to terrorizing everyone within arm's reach. Braziliano eventually faded from the historical record, which probably means he either died in a fight nobody bothered to write down or drank himself to death on some unnamed beach. Either way, his legacy wasn't treasure or territory. It was fear. the kind of fear that comes from knowing your captain might kill you tonight for no reason at all. Pirate number 4, Charles Vane. Now let's move forward about 60 years to the Golden Age of Piracy. The early 1700s. Nassau in the Bahamas has replaced Port Royal as the pirate capital of the world, and the most dangerous men alive are operating out of its harbor. Charles Vane was one of them. If Braziliano's problem was that he was a violent drunk, Vane's problem was different. Vane was calculating, cold. He didn't lose control. He was in control the entire time, and that somehow made it worse. Vane operated primarily in the waters around the Bahamas, the Carolinas, and the broader Caribbean. He targeted merchant ships, and he was good at it. His crew took significant prizes and split considerable loot. On paper, sailing with Vane should have been a good deal. But Vane had a reputation that followed him everywhere he went. He was known for extreme cruelty toward prisoners, not just robbing captured crews, which was standard. Vane tortured them. He beat sailors for information about hidden cargo and then kept beating them after they'd already given it up. He hanged prisoners from the yardarm as a warning to the next ship. He burned vessels with crew still aboard. And here's the thing that made Vane particularly dangerous to his own men. He didn't just punish enemies. He punished dissent. Pirate ships operated on a rough form of democracy. Crews could vote to replace their captain if they felt he was incompetent or unfair. This happened all the time during the Golden Age. It was one of the things that made piracy function. A bad captain got removed. A good one kept his position. Vane didn't accept that system. Not really. He used it when it benefited him and ignored it when it didn't. The most famous example came in late 1718 when Vane's crew spotted a large French warship. Most of Vane's men wanted to engage. They saw a big prize and wanted to take it. But Vane refused to fight. He argued the ship was too heavily armed and ordered a retreat. Now, on any other pirate ship, the captain refusing to fight would have been handled through a vote. The crew would have discussed it, maybe replaced Vane, and moved on. But Vane's crew knew something the history books don't always emphasize. Disagreeing with Charles Vane publicly was dangerous. Not because he'd shout at you, because he might kill you for it later, quietly, when nobody expected it. The crew did eventually vote him out after the French warship incident. They replaced him with his quartermaster, a man named Calico Jack Rackham, who would go on to become famous in his own right. Vane was put on a small sloop with a handful of loyal men and essentially exiled from his own crew. But even after being deposed, Vane continued pirating. He captured more ships. He tortured more crews. He built another following, though a smaller one. His end came when he was shipwrecked on a small island in the Bay of Honduras. He survived for weeks, living off whatever he could find, until a passing ship picked him up. Unfortunately for Vane, the captain of that ship recognized him, and not in a good way. That captain was a former buccaneer named Holford, and Holford knew Vane's reputation well enough to refuse him passage. Holford reportedly told Vane that he wouldn't take him aboard because he'd likely murder everyone on the ship and steal it. That's the kind of reputation Vane had. Even other pirates didn't trust him. Vane was eventually captured, taken to Port Royal, tried for piracy, and hanged in March of 1721. His body was placed in a gibbet at Gun Cay as a warning to other pirates. But the warning wasn't really about piracy in general. It was about what happens when you lead through fear instead of respect. Vane's own crew kicked him out because following him felt more dangerous than defying him. And in the world of piracy, where danger was the entire business model, that's saying something. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Pirate number 3, Edward Lowe. If Charles Vane was cold and calculating, Edward Lowe was something else entirely. Lowe was sadistic in a way that made even other pirates uncomfortable. And in a profession filled with violent men doing violent things, That distinction is worth paying attention to. Edward Lowe began his criminal career in the streets of London, where he grew up poor, orphaned young, and spent his childhood pickpocketing and running small scams. He eventually moved to Boston, worked briefly as a shiprigger, and then turned to piracy around 1722 after a dispute with his foreman that ended with Lowe throwing a loaded musket at the man's head. From that point forward, Lowe carved out one of the most disturbing careers in pirate history. Lowe operated primarily in the Atlantic, moving between the Caribbean, the eastern seaboard of the American colonies, and the waters around the Azores and Cape Verde. He was fast, he was aggressive, and he was, by any reasonable standard, a psychopath. The list of things Edward Lowe did to captured prisoners reads like a horror novel. He cut off a Portuguese captain's lips, cooked them in front of him, and then forced the man to eat them. He sliced open the chest of another captive and removed the man's heart while he was still alive, then forced a companion to eat it. He burned ships with captured crews locked below deck. He tortured prisoners for sport, not for information, and often prolonged the suffering specifically because he enjoyed watching it. These aren't exaggerations passed down through legend. These are documented accounts from multiple sources during Lowe's active years. Other pirates, captured sailors, and colonial authorities all described the same patterns. Edward Lowe wasn't just violent, he was creative about his violence, which is a deeply disturbing sentence to write, but an accurate one. But here's what makes Lowe relevant to this list specifically. His own crew was terrified of him. Lowe had a temper that could erupt without warning. A perceived slight, a wrong look, a hesitation in following an order. Any of these could trigger an explosion of violence that landed on whoever happened to be standing closest. His crew members walked carefully around him, spoke carefully to him, and never, under any circumstances, challenged his authority directly. There's a famous account of Lowe slashing one of his own men's face during an argument over the division of plunder. Not an enemy, not a prisoner, one of his own sailors. The man survived, but the message was clear. Disagreement with Edward Lowe carried a physical cost that no amount of shared treasure was worth. Lowe's first mate, a man named Charles Harris, was eventually captured by the Royal Navy. Harris and his crew were tried, and most were hanged. But the testimony from those trials reveals something important. Several of Lowe's former crew members described being forced to participate in atrocities they wanted no part of. They didn't torture prisoners because they wanted to. They did it because refusing meant becoming a target themselves. That's the defining characteristic of a pirate whose crew feared him. Not just brutality toward enemies, but a constant simmering threat directed inward. The knowledge that the man standing at the helm was as dangerous to you as anything the ocean could throw at you. Lowe's end remains uncertain. Some accounts say he was set adrift by his own crew after murdering one of his officers in his sleep. Others claim the French Navy captured him near the coast of Brazil and hanged him. There's no confirmed death, which somehow makes the whole story even more unsettling. Edward Lowe might have just disappeared, taking his particular brand of horror with him into whatever anonymous grave history forgot to mark. Pirate number 2, Francois Lolon. We're going back to the 1660s now. Same Caribbean waters, same cycle of violence. But Francois Lolon was operating on a level that made even Roach Braziliano look restrained, and that's not a sentence anyone should have to write. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Lolon was born Jean-David Nau in Les Sables d'Olonne, France, around 1630. He came to the Caribbean as an indentured servant, essentially a slave in all but legal technicality, and spent years working in the brutal plantation system of the French colonies. When his term of servitude ended, he drifted into buccaneering, which was common for men who had no money, no connections, and no other options. But Lolonais didn't just drift into piracy. He threw himself into it with a ferocity that alarmed everyone around him. His primary targets were the Spanish, and he had reasons for that hatred that went beyond simple profit. The Spanish colonial system had caused enormous suffering throughout the Caribbean, and Lolonais had witnessed and experienced that suffering firsthand during his years as a servant. Whether that explains his later behavior or merely provides context for it is a question historians still argue about. What isn't argued about is what he actually did. Lolonais became famous for one thing above all others. He tortured Spanish prisoners with a creativity and enthusiasm that shocked even his fellow buccaneers. He would slice prisoners apart piece by piece, cutting off limbs and ears while asking questions he already knew the answers to. He would tie burning fuses between victims' fingers and let them burn down to the skin. He would stretch prisoners on makeshift racks until their joints separated. And then there's the incident that cemented his reputation forever. After capturing a group of Spanish soldiers during an assault on the Venezuelan coast, Lolonais reportedly cut open a prisoner's chest with his cutlass, pulled out the man's still beating heart, and bit into it while the other captives watched. Then he turned to the surviving prisoners and told them the same thing would happen to them unless they revealed the location of an ambush. They talked. Obviously, they talked. Everyone talked when Lolonais was asking. Now, whether that specific incident happened exactly as described has been debated by historians for centuries. The primary source is Esquemelin again, the same buccaneer-turned-writer who documented Braziliano. Some scholars argue that Esquemelin exaggerated for dramatic effect. Others point out that multiple independent sources corroborate the general character of Lolonais' behavior, even if specific details might be embellished. But here's what matters for our purposes. His crew believed these stories were true. And even if they witnessed only half of what Esquemelin describes, that was more than enough to create a culture of absolute terror aboard his ships. Lolonais led one of the most successful buccaneering raids in Caribbean history when he sacked Maracaibo and Gibraltar in Venezuela in 1667. The raid yielded an enormous amount of treasure and established Lolonais as the most feared pirate in the hemisphere. But the raid also demonstrated something his crew already knew. Following Lolonais meant participating in acts that would haunt you for the rest of your life. The sacking of Maracaibo involved weeks of torture, murder, and destruction that went far beyond what was necessary to secure the town's wealth. His crew followed him through it, not because they were equally sadistic. Some of them probably were, sure. But many of them followed because the chain of command on a buccaneer vessel was enforced not by votes or contracts, but by the captain's willingness to inflict consequences. And nobody inflicted consequences like Francois Lolonais. His death, when it finally came, was poetic in the worst possible way. After the Maracaibo raid, Lolonais organized another expedition, this time to Central America. But this voyage was cursed from the start. His ships were becalmed for weeks. Food ran out, disease spread. His crew began to turn on him, not through mutiny, but through quiet desertion. Men slipped away whenever the ships came close enough to shore, preferring the jungle to another day under Lolonais' command. Eventually, Lolonais and a small remaining group were captured by the Kuna people, an indigenous group in the Darien region of modern-day Panama. According to Esquemelin, the Kuna tore Lolonais apart, burned his remains, and scattered the ashes. The man who had spent his career pulling people apart was pulled apart himself. The Caribbean has a long memory, and it doesn't care about irony. Pirate number 1, Zheng Yi Sao. Everything we've talked about so far has been in the Caribbean. European pirates, colonial waters, ships carrying Spanish gold or English tobacco. Now we're going to the South China Sea. Different ocean, different century, different scale entirely. Zheng Yi Sao, also known as Qing Shi, commanded the largest pirate fleet in recorded history. Not the largest Chinese pirate fleet, the largest pirate fleet, period. At her peak, she controlled somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 ships, and anywhere from 70,000 to 80,000 pirates. For context, that's more ships than most national navies at the time. The Spanish Armada that tried to invade England in 1588 had about 130 ships. Zheng Yi Sao had more than 10 times that, and she held that fleet together through a combination of strategic brilliance, political cunning, and a code of discipline so harsh that her own pirates lived in constant fear of violating it. Her story begins in the floating brothels of Canton, now modern-day Guangzhou, around 1775. Her birth name was Xu Xianggu, and she worked as a prostitute before marrying the pirate captain Zheng Yi in 1801. Together, they built a coalition of pirate fleets in the South China Sea, uniting rival factions under a single banner. When Zheng Yi died in 1807, his wife took command. And this is where the story gets extraordinary. Taking over a pirate fleet as a woman in early 19th century China should have been impossible. The men who sailed these ships were hardened criminals and experienced fighters who had no cultural framework for following a female commander. Zheng Yi Sao didn't just overcome that obstacle, she obliterated it. She did it by establishing a code of laws so strict and so brutally enforced that nobody dared test her authority. The code covered everything. Distribution of plunder was regulated down to exact percentages. Captured goods had to be registered and inspected before anyone touched them. Taking anything without authorization, even something small, was punishable by death. Desertion was punishable by death. Disobeying a direct order was punishable by death. But the rules that her crew feared most were the ones governing behavior toward captives and civilian populations. Pirates who assaulted captive women were executed. Full stop. No exceptions. No appeals. If a pirate took a captive woman as a wife, he was expected to treat her well and remain faithful to her. If he didn't, he was killed. If a pirate raped a captive, he was beheaded. This sounds progressive, and in some ways it was. But the enforcement mechanism was anything but gentle. Zheng Yi Sao's punishments were public, swift, and designed to be memorable. Pirates who violated the code were flogged, clapped in irons, quartered, or beheaded in front of the assembled fleet. Minor offenses earned lashes that left permanent scars. Major offenses earned death, usually carried out the same day the offense was discovered. The result was a fleet that operated with military precision. Zheng Yi Sao's pirates didn't just raid random ships. They controlled entire trade routes. They collected taxes from coastal villages. They demanded protection money from merchant vessels. They essentially ran a floating government, complete with its own legal system, taxation structure, and enforcement apparatus. But it was a government built on fear. Her captains knew that any deviation from the code would be punished without mercy. Her sailors knew that complaining about the rules was almost as dangerous as breaking them. And her enemies knew that fighting back was pointless against a force that size. The Qing Dynasty Navy tried to stop her. They failed. The Portuguese Navy tried to stop her. They failed. The combined forces of multiple nations attempted coordinated attacks on her fleet and accomplished nothing of lasting significance. Zheng Yi Sao wasn't defeated. She retired. In 1810, the Qing government offered her amnesty, not because they'd beaten her, because they couldn't. The deal allowed her to keep a portion of her fleet, retain her personal wealth, and live freely for the rest of her life. She negotiated from a position of absolute strength, and the Chinese government accepted her terms because the alternative was continued humiliation. She spent her remaining years running a gambling house in Canton and died peacefully in 1844 at the age of 68 or 69. Think about that. In a profession where almost everyone died violently, by hanging, in battle, by disease, or at the hands of their own crew, Zheng Yi Sao walked away. She kept her money, she kept her freedom, she kept her life. But the pirates who served under her would tell you a different story about what that looked like from the inside. The code that made her fleet so effective was the same code that made every day a high-wire act. One wrong move, one stolen piece of loot, one unauthorized interaction with a captive, and you were dead before sunset, with the entire fleet watching. Zheng Yi Sao didn't lead through charisma. She didn't lead through shared ideology. She led through a system of absolute rules and absolute consequences. Her pirates didn't follow her because they loved her. They followed her because the system she built left them no other option. And that, more than the size of her fleet, or the wealth she accumulated, or the governments she humiliated, is what makes her the most feared pirate on this list. She didn't just use fear as a tool, she built an entire empire on it. Every pirate on this list operated in different waters, in different centuries, with different methods. Braziliano burned prisoners on spits in the 1660s Caribbean. Vane terrorized the Golden Age Bahamas with cold, calculating cruelty. Lowe mutilated captives and crew members alike across the Atlantic. Lolon literally ate the hearts of his enemies in Venezuela. And Zheng Yi Sao enforced a legal code in the South China Sea that made her own fleet of 80,000 pirates afraid to step out of line. But the thread connecting all 5 of them is the same. Their crews didn't just respect them. They didn't just follow them. They feared them. The kind of fear that sits in your stomach when you're trying to sleep. The kind that makes you choose your words carefully, watch where you step, and never, under any circumstances, let yourself be the one who draws attention. Piracy has always been romanticized. The freedom, the adventure, the treasure. But for the men and women who actually lived it, under captains like these, the reality was something else entirely. It was survival. Every single day. Not from the sea, not from the enemy. From the person standing at the helm.